What's going on, everybody? I hope you're doing good. This is Pastor Sam. We are in our series called The Original Game of Thrones, where we're going through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and talking about the rise of the monarchy in early Israel. Now, this has kind of been a little bit of a hit or miss series for me. I just randomly throw one of these videos up. But what I want to do is kind of get you caught up to where we're at. Now, if you get a chance and you want to do that on your own, you could go back and look at some of the past videos in this series. Just go to the YouTube page and look under, I think it's The Original Game of Thrones, and you can see all the videos in that series. Now, basically where we're at is you have the rise of Saul under Samuel. Samuel is the prophet of Israel. That's how the book starts out. It starts out with his birth. It starts out with him leading the nation in revival, helping to unite the nation. And Saul is anointed Israel's first king when the people decide they want to be like the nations around them. Saul starts out well. He is able to win, a few key victories. However, he does not stay on that path. He becomes stubborn and disobedient towards God. And that's one thing, but when he's called on it, rather than show a humble and a repentant heart, Saul refuses to repent. He offers excuses. And because of that, God rejects Saul as the king of Israel. Meanwhile, he has in the wings a young boy from Bethlehem, a shepherd boy by the name of David, whom Samuel goes and anoints as the next king of Israel. And where we're at in the narrative is we're at the point where Saul is on the decline. His popularity, his mental stability, who he is in his position as king, it's on the decline. People are starting to see what kind of man Saul really is. While David, on the other hand, is on the rise. People have seen his victory over Goliath. They have seen his fidelity towards Saul and the nation of Israel as a whole. They have seen him as a mighty warrior, somebody who leads by example. This is a stark contrast to Saul. Even in the story of David and Goliath, you see Saul kind of cowering in the tent while David takes it upon himself to go out there and face this seemingly insurmountable foe. And this gains, again, the attention of the people. This causes Saul's jealousy and his rage toward David to grow, so much so that he attempts to kill David on multiple occasions. In addition to that, you see a lot of tension between Saul and his son Jonathan, because Jonathan and David are very close. And for a while, David is kind of caught between two. He's trying to show some fidelity towards his father, but at the same time, he knows David is in the right. And so we're at the point where David and Jonathan have finally come to the conclusion the best thing for David to do is to just get out of town. And so David runs into the wilderness to hide. And he comes to the place called Adullam, or the cave of Adullam, and this becomes a stronghold for David. And while David is there, the discontented, those who are in debt, those who see the spiritual condition of Israel come to him. His family as well. So let me just read a couple of verses here. It says, David therefore departed. And therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So his brothers and all his father's house heard it, and they went down there to meet him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them. So a couple of things I want to note here in this passage. One, I want you to note that these men were willing to put their life on the line for David. First of all, his family, which we would kind of assume. But it does say a lot that your brothers gain your respect, so much so they're willing to put their life on the line for you. But also, many of Israel's elite warriors come to David's side. They had fought with David. They had seen David's character in the heat of battle. They knew David was the man to follow. And it says a lot about David himself, that David had showed fidelity to Saul, had showed fidelity to Israel, and as a result, people started to show fidelity towards him. And when David left, these men didn't have to go and follow David. But because of David's character, because of David's willingness to lay his life on the line, because of David in the heat of battle being an example for his men to follow, these men were willing to put their lives on the line for him. They knew that this was God's man and this was God's time for him. And so they went to the cave to meet him there, and David becomes a leader to them. I think this is, again, another statement, not only of God's blessing on David, but of David's character and him as a person showing godliness and fidelity, loyalty, ever how you want to put it. And so with that being said, I want you to note what David didn't do, okay? Notice David doesn't try to bring people along with him. He goes and then the people naturally follow him. He is not trying to manipulate people by making extravagant promises. He doesn't try to manipulate people by proposing some grandiose vision as opposed to what Saul is doing. And on the back half of that, he's not trying to badmouth. You don't see him badmouth Saul in order to gain, popularity or in order to make himself look good in the eyes of these men. These men know who David is and they follow him. He doesn't need all that other stuff. And so they began to follow him. That being said, a couple of things. As we look at David's character, we look at his willingness to sacrifice. A couple of things I want us to kind of keep in mind. David is in a difficult place. Okay? He does not deny that. But David is able to be in that difficult place, surrounded by discontented, disgruntled people, and David is able to take these discontented, disgruntled people in the midst of a difficult place, and he's able to use it for good. Okay? Eventually, David becomes kind of like a warrior for hire, what do you call it, a mercenary, okay? And so he still wants to serve his nation. And so David kind of lives on the fringes of the borders of Israel. Israel was surrounded by their enemies, the Philistines, among others. And as a result, the people who lived near the borders were always under threat of attack. And so what David would do is he would use these men who came to him, rather than try to muster an army against Saul, rather than sit in self-pity and constantly be complaining. David builds an army, and he uses these men to defend the borders of Israel, to defend the people of Israel. That, if you go to the story of Nabal, that's what that story is mostly about. David had been defending the people who lived on the borders of Israel from their enemies, and David expected some sort of payment as a result for that, But so David is serving his nation. David is being faithful to his nation, and he's still trying to be faithful to Saul. Later on, you'll find there are times where people will try to gloat over Saul's defeats. There are times where they'll try to get David to kill Saul, that he's got a chance to kill. And David says, no, I won't do it. This is God's man. This is the anointed of Israel, and there's no way I'm going to lay my hand on him. And so during all that, you just continue to see, again, David's character. So what I want to do is I want us to look at, Psalm 142. Psalm 142 was written during David's sojourn in the wilderness. And so I want us to look at that. And I think there are some things that we can learn. All of us have probably been in dark places. We've probably been in places where we didn't plan to be. We have a plan, we have a vision for our life, and inevitably life always throws us a curveball, or we end up kind of in a position we weren't expecting. This is where David's at. So how do we respond? How do we respond so that we can still be used by God during those situations? And so let's look at Psalm 142. I'm going to read a few verses and then we'll just kind of discuss these. I think there are three big things we can pull out of Psalm 142, which was written during this time period. David says I'll read the first two verses. I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. Here's the first thing. David is honest about his misgivings. David does not deny the place he's at, and he does not deny the trouble or the internal turmoil he's probably feeling about this. I'm sure there are times David questioned whether or not he was really going to be the king of Israel. There were probably times he questioned God's plan for his life. I know Samuel anointed me king. I know I'm supposed to eventually, but am I really? And all of us have probably been through those moments in our lives, right? Where we're questioning God's plan. We're questioning God's direction for our life. And that's where David is, and he doesn't lie about it. He pours his heart out to God. So he is honest about his misgivings. He's honest about the position he's in. He's not living in denial. And he says, I cry out to you, what? With my voice. I make supplication. I pour out my complaint to you, O God. I'm complaining here. I'm not happy where I'm at. I'm frustrated about my situation right now. And so he is honest. That's the first thing. Here's the second thing. Verse 3 says, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path. Number 2, he acknowledges God's providence in his life. I don't like where I'm at, but God, I know you know the way. I know you are directing my steps. I did not plan to be here, but I'm here. And I realize, Lord, this is not by accident. And I don't know where you're at in your life. Is it some sickness you're facing? You're having a family turmoil. Maybe you've lost a job or whatever. I don't know where you're at, what bad place. You've suffered, some sort of abuse or someone's lied about you and it's ruined your reputation. I don't know where you're at in your life right now. I just want to tell you this. God is not surprised by it. And wherever you're at right now, it can still be used. That situation, God is using it to shape you. God is using it. This is now becoming God's way of not only shaping you, but giving your life direction, honing you as it were. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind, that where you're at right now is not an accident. And so David acknowledges God's providence and his sovereignty. He says, when my spirit was overwhelmed, when I was frustrated, I didn't like where I was, you knew my path. You knew it, God. You knew this path. And here's the third thing. He says here in verse 7, he talks about in verse 5, I cried out to you, Lord. I said, you are my refuge. Then in verse 7, he says, bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully for me. So what David does is in the midst of his turmoil, in the midst of his trouble, he looks for opportunity. He now has all these men around him. He has these men that have pledged their allegiance to him, and he sees that on the fringes of his nation, there are people suffering. The Philistines come in from time to time and they raid people. Other enemies come in, they try to destroy, people's crops and, give people such a hard time. And so what David does is in the midst of his turmoil, in the midst of his bad place, he looks for opportunity and he sees it. He says, I got 400 guys here, some of the most elite soldiers in all of Israel. There are people on the fringes of my nation that are suffering. We're going to put a stop to that. God's called me to shepherd this people. I don't need a position. I don't need to be enthroned as the king to do that. I'm living out here on the fringes where these people are suffering, and I'm going to be their shepherd. Their shepherd ain't present, but I'm going to be their shepherd. And so he looks for opportunity. And I would tell you, no matter where you're at in your life, no matter what suffering you're going through, there's always an opportunity to serve God and to serve his people. So hopefully this is encouraging and instructive, if not challenging. And I just want to pray that God's blessing upon you and that he will use you no matter where you're at in your life. God bless.